Okay, we'll start off. I think if she joins, then she'll come online, not a problem. So what we're looking at doing today is obviously looking at covering learning outcome 4, which is related to understanding why we need to look at sharing, storing, and obviously how do we basically maintain internal records in terms of information. I think this is a key which normally all awarding bodies ask for when we look at, in particular, the records when they come in to do external audits. So when we look at, in particular, the aspect of, the aspect of how do we manage information and how do we ensure that only relevant people have access to this information because of data protection regulations. That is what we need to be essentially covering in today's learning outcome. There are 2 assessment criteria. And here, what we are looking at focusing on is the aspect related to why do awarding bodies prescribe the storage of information? How long do awarding bodies prescribe the storage? And, so that if at all there are audits, inspections which are required to be done, and in such cases, then the safe storage of this information allows it to be retrieved safely and obviously used for the purposes of inspection, audits, or quality assurance. So one of the assessment criteria is applying procedures for recording, storing, and reporting information. And the second one is what procedures need to be followed to maintain confidentiality of the internal quality assurance records. And in most cases, what we see is when we do work with awarding organizations, what we do see is that there is a period of at least 3 to 5 years, in some cases even 6 years, that institutions have to then follow this regulation to be able to store data and store data safely so that it's easily retrievable and is easily available for the purpose of any sort of audit, inspection, or quality assurance purposes. Now, one of the things that we need to address in this learning outcome will also be that how do we ensure the confidentiality of the assessment process, which is what is the overarching aspect within the learning outcome itself. So the confidentiality that we need to look at is to ensure that we have in the institution clear policies and procedures which are available, which allow us to establish that the data, if at all it needs to be shared outside the organization, then it needs to be anonymized. And this anonymization of data should be done wherever possible so that the identity of the individuals is kept, safe. And only limited authorized personnel should have access to this data. And that too also clearance process or processes in terms of some sort of a data, I would say, access or restriction process needs to be put in place so that people, when they need the access to this data, what is this data? So if I look at putting my thinking hat on, and if I look at what data is required to be shared, so data could be related to assessment records, data could be related to internal quality assurance records, data could be related to exam papers or exam scripts, data could be related to registrations, which are obviously stored within the organization when a learner joins a particular course or qualification. And in some cases, you would also look at data which is related to, say, for example, appeals, procedures, complaints which have been received. And if the resolution of these complaints has been done as per the documented procedure in the organization, then those would also be served or essentially stored as confidential data. Now, in most organizations, we would also relate it to the fact that when we look at Journal Data Protection Regulation, there is a designated DPO, which is called the Data Protection Officer. And the role of the Data Protection Officer is primarily to ensure that if people want their data to be removed after a certain minimum time frame, then they can write to the DPO for this data to be removed from records of the organization. The DPO is also required to ascertain and allow access to the information to individuals who are required to have access to that information. And in some cases, obviously, if data has to be shared outside the organization, then the data has to be anonymized, and all that is pretty much within the context of, I would say, confidentiality and data protection regulation. And this is where the data records tend to come in. So when you look at one of the aspects that if if I study a particular qualification, and just as an example, and if that qualification is graded, then the grades that I achieve in my qualification or in my units or modules that I cover should be should be kept confidential. And when they are kept confidential, if they have to be shared outside or shared with other learners, then in such cases, the names need to be removed, or wherever we see personal data in those records, they will have to be removed to ensure confidentiality, which is specifically required in the case of assessments. Because what we don't want to be able to do is leave that open or leave it for easy pickings, which then allow people to compare and challenge, for example, the assessment process or the quality assurance process. And in such cases, the main reason is to follow this process of, whereas information relevant to internal quality assurance or assessment records has to be kept confidential. Assessment decisions have to be kept confidential. There has to be a paperwork or a paper trail which basically backs up these decisions. And the role of the IQA tends to be that the role of the IQA is to make sure that the allocation and the storage of this data is done in an appropriate manner so that the confidentiality of the learners and the assessors can be maintained. And in such cases, if it is to be shared outside, as I mentioned, then the data anonymization needs to be done so that the assessment decisions cannot be challenged, and the person behind those assessment decisions should not be identified. Because in such cases, when we look at sharing it externally, then minimum amount of information which is required for the necessary purposes needs to be shared, in a manner wherein the individual has the access rights to be able to access that information. So we'll be looking at this bit in a bit more detail in the presentation, and this is to understand how do we manage, maintain, record and report accuracy of data, accurately save it, store it, and then if required, can be retrieved. And this retrieval of information is access-based. So depending on individuals who are required to access it, should be able to access it. And that sharing of information, if it needs to be done appropriately, in which the anonymization of the learner's identity or any sort of personal data has to be maintained. Now, when we go into some of the slides, what we want to be able to look at is revisit one or two small things. Now, first things first, what we need to understand is how do we classify or what do we say is data? So when we look at data, any sort of, records which are produced, created, or essentially shared, which have personal information or some sort of information related to learners, assessors, IQA, and the organization will all constitute data. Now, when this data is processed into some sort of meaningful information report, so for example, if a learner submits the assignment, that is still a data. But when that assignment is assessed and a front cover sheet is filled in our case, for example, as we do that, and some sort of formative summative feedback is provided, that data then becomes information, because that has feedback from the assessor going to the learner. And in such cases, that record or that particular form of data is now morphed into what is called information. Now, this information on which, when judgments are made, decisions are made, grades are awarded, then in such cases, this information then becomes what is called, knowledge. And in such cases, when this becomes a judgment, wherein it becomes a piece of information on which a final judgment has been passed by the internal quality assurer, the head of compliance, or maybe a quality manager within the organization, then in such cases, this particular form of information then becomes, an internal record, and that record typically would have information related to learner, the grade achievement, and the assessment decision. And in such cases, this is something which is required to be stored and accessed specifically by people who have been given access to get hold of that information. So when we look at the process through which data gets converted into information, information into knowledge or some sort of final judgment, which is what needs to be kept confidential. In such cases, we go through this outline of looking at assurance, record keeping, look at some aspects of feedback. And in some cases, when that feedback is recorded, stored, and has to be retrieved, then in those cases, we will look at this being put into the process of what is called the data protection and monitoring policy. Now, in our case, if we look at, if I put it this way, that in our case, if we look at a practical example of what constitutes data, one of the forms of data that we do see within an educational setup or an institution collating would be personal records. So, for example, I'm starting with the pre-admission process. So, for example, in this case, when somebody applies to join a course at the college, there is some confidential or personal information which comes in, and that consists of things like proof of identity, proof of address, a copy of their CV, prior qualifications, in some cases, a personal statement. Now, this particular bit that you get to see is all information, and this information has to have a restricted access because this can be utilized, or if it falls into the wrong hands, it can be misutilized or, used, misappropriated. So things like date of birth, things like, your details in terms of where you've studied, how you've studied, what is your experience, age, and these kind of records have to be kept confidential. Now, if you move from the admission stage to somebody who has got enrolled into the course and studying, at that stage, what we will look at is one of the first thing which gets collated is the assessment record. That means when assignments or exams are done, or when some sort of assessments are sat, whether it's exams, assignments, or any other form of assessments which could be related to group discussions, or assessments which are even done at place of work. In such cases, records which are getting created out of those observations will tend to be what is called assessment records, and they would need to be stored safely. Now, if I look at assignments, it could be rubrics cube records, which are basically how the assessment criteria is, what is the marking scheme, and they would need to be kept confidential because at the end of the day, papers change, questions change, but at some point in time, the marking scheme, which is something which is relevant to the organization, needs to be kept confidential, because if the marking scheme gets outside or gets to be known by students, then in such cases, it could lead to some sort of, I would say, unfair advantage for some students who have access to that scheme because they know how the marking scheme works, what parts of the assignment are graded, what parts of the assignments or probably exams are graded or graded carry higher grades. And in such cases, this can be disadvantageous to some of the other learners. Now, once we know that these are records that need to be kept safe. So another example that I would give you is in certain organizations, when you have exams or paper-based exams, you receive the examination papers a couple of days in advance before the exam date. And in such cases, the examination officer's responsibility within the organization is to keep those papers in a secure and a locked place, which means that no person should have authorized access to it unless they've been authorized or their role and responsibility requires them to have access to those papers. So those papers are then handed over by the examination officer to the tutors on the day on which the exam is to be sat, maybe an hour before. And once the papers are opened, it's opened in front of a few people. And then at some stage, once the papers are done and the learners have sat the papers, the answer sheets, including the question papers, are collected back, and then it goes back into the secure record. So in such cases, it prevents the leakage, spread, or I would say unwanted sharing of question papers, which are confidential for the organization and for the awarding organization to be shared outside. So in such cases, controlled monitoring is required. And that monitoring means that people with restricted access or people with access will only be able to get hold of that data and would be responsible for keeping that particular material, which is exam papers, safe. Now, When the papers are marked and before the results are released, the papers also have to be kept, or the assessments have to be kept confidential, because they have not been approved by the exam board. They've not been, the grades have not been confirmed by the exam board. And in such cases, you would have to look at that any feedback which is provided on such scripts, whether it's assignments or exam scripts, they have to be kept confidential. And till such date, when the exam board ratifies those results, they would need to be kept in a secure, in a safe place, which allows the decisions to be, confidential. And once the exam board happens, then the dissemination of information can happen through relevant channels. In some cases, you would see that notification of results, NORs as we call them, is normally done. In some cases, the exam transcripts are then shared with the learners, wherein they are able to see the marked exam strips and they know what grades they've achieved. Now, in the entire process, data protection and confidentiality is important because it keeps the sanctity of papers, question papers, assessments, assignments safe. Now, the reason why this is done is because most awarding organizations typically, release assignments once in every 2 years or 3 years. So in such cases, you have an exam assignment release date and an assignment submission date. When you sit papers which are GCSE, A levels, functional skills, or exams at level 3, T levels in particular, then what you have to do is you have to ensure that the papers, when they are given to the learners for the purposes of sitting an exam, they are collected back, and then the sanctity of these papers are maintained in the question bank. So at any given point in time, the awarding body might have 10 papers, and those 10 papers will not be disclosed. The information on those papers will not be disclosed to outside anybody apart from the learners who are taking the exams. There are sometimes also notices and announcements to share that please do not put any material relevant to the papers on social media. And most awarding bodies, which typically look at test conditions, they clearly mention that we monitor social media. And in such cases, if the information is put out on channels which compromises the papers and the sanctity of these question papers, then your results could also mean that these results could be disqualified. So in such cases, the protection is, and the confidentiality is primarily done to ensure the sanctity of the process, which is the examination process, to restrict the access to, the information, and also to ensure that there is a fairness which is maintained when these, when, for example, learners sit any sort of test, and the fairness is maintained because the learners who are sitting the test under test conditions have no access to the papers. And in such cases, it allows learners to, I would say, gives them a fair advantage or a fair chance to be able to achieve grades without having the prior knowledge of what the papers and material consist of. So managing information related to internal quality assurance, assessment processes needs to be one of the clear responsibility of the organization, which is involved in teaching and delivery of qualifications. So in our case, we have 3 procedures. For example, if we have to look at what are these procedures that we have in place. So one of the procedures that we have in place is the monitoring policy. There is an examination policy, and the third is malpractice policy. So these 3 policies that we look at, if we look at procedures, so we have examination policy, and I'll show you that in a second. We have malpractice policy, and we have the monitoring policy. Monitoring policy. To a certain extent, we can also say conflict of interest policy, which is typically in organizations also required to be there, because of the fact that in some cases, what you would generally see is that if there are people who are known to you within the organization, and because they are known to you and you're sitting a test, then in such cases, the person needs to declare that there is a conflict of interest because you're related to that person maybe, or you are known to that person, and because of which it can create some sort of an unfair advantage for you. And in such cases, these policies, have to be looked at to be implemented within the organization simply because they are required to ensure the managing of information related to internal quality assurance processes and to ensure that the records are or the examination papers are kept, safe. So if I look at the policies section on our website, these are the policies that we look at. One is data protection. The other is conflict of interest. The third is the examination policy. And the fourth is malpractice policy or academic misconduct policy. So if I look at just opening one policy, which is exam policy that we want to look at, this policy very clearly, gives out the roles and responsibilities of the examination officer and the relevant IQA or IQA colleagues within the organization to ensure that they are responsible for protecting the integrity of the qualification and the examination for the duration that they have the access to the test papers or the relevant information. So this policy mandates, from a point of view of following to ensure that, we are having procedures in place to deal with plagiarism, collusion, examination malpractice, which could be cheating, people copying, people colluding with each other to solve papers. This policy also covers secure testing, examination, and invigilation. That means as an organization, when we have this policy, we have somebody who's an invigilator. He has undergone through the process and training of being an invigilator, and he understands where and how learners can cheat or can use cheating as a process to get unfair advantage in sitting exams or papers. And we need to ensure that we have appropriate deterrents and sanctions in place to minimize any risk of collusion and malpractice. So as a result, what we are able to do is we are able to apply these procedures, which are basically policies, to ensure that the information that we have is secured, it is stored safely, it is secure, and people with relevant access to the information only have access to it. As a result, what it ensures overall is the overall sanctity of the entire process of examinations or assessments that we need to look at. So this explains, the overarching, I would say, reason why we want to look at internally maintaining and improving and ensuring that the quality of assessment and assurance processes are in place so that the assessments are fair. The assessments, when they are done and judgments are passed, then they are kept secure. And in such cases, when they have to be retrieved, this information is easily retrievable by relevant people, which is assessors, head of quality or compliance within the organization during external examination visits, during inspections, and in some cases, spot inspections, which typically happen, to check whether the college or the institution is following the relevant procedures and ensuring the sanctity of this information. Is that okay? Any questions so far?
No, nothing, sir. Nothing.
Now, what we want to do is basically look at the aspect of, going into the two assessment criteria that we have and what do we need to do to ensure that, we apply this procedure of storing and, obviously looking at the information and making sure that this information is stored in a safe manner, is retrievable when required, and allows, these decisions and the, let's say, the storage of this information to happen for a couple of years as per the awarding body guidelines. So when we have to apply these procedures for recording, storing, and reporting information, what we need to look at is we need to be able to look at our policies and procedures. So quality policies, which are under the quality policy, if I look at, we look at monitoring of records, we look at registration policy, and we also look at how the assessments and IQA records are generally stored within the organization. And in some cases, you would see when organizations have the ISO standards implemented, they would also have version control, which is implemented within the documentation. So when we look at papers for previous years or assignments briefed for previous years, you generally see that they carry a version number, and that goes to show that, one, we cannot circulate a previous year's assignment brief into this year, which avoids errors, such, administrative errors. And in some cases, it is also maintained to ensure that we know that there are changes which have been done to the qualification or the assignments or the examination papers, which are relevant to the unit specification or the course specification that is being delivered within the institution. Now, in such cases, you would look at managing and maintaining records. You would look at access to these records being done through some sort of standardization forms. So when we know that, say, for example, sometimes in schools, when you have to access records, or in colleges, when you have to access records, what teachers have to do is, nowadays it is mostly electronic, but normally what they would need to do is send in a request to the authorization officer, which is the course manager or the quality manager, and then the link, or for example, the access to SharePoint or wherever the data is stored is made available, and it is available for a certain duration of time, 1 day, 2 day, or 3 day. In the earlier days, it used to be all paper-based. So obviously you need to fill up a form. That form had to be signed by the principal or the authorizing officer. And then when you take it to the library or the archive section, then those records could have been retrieved for the purposes of, say, for example, monitoring or for some reasons of audit and inspection. Now, when we look at this process of accuracy of recording, why is it important? The accuracy of recording is important because most awarding organizations typically say, I'll give you an example, prescribe a very clear duration in terms of date of registration, the date from which the learner has joined the course and the date at which the learner has been registered. There's normally 28-day period which is allowed, and all learners need to be registered within the 28 days of starting the course. Now, look at how this would have a cascading effect on when the exam board happens. Now, if I have a learner starting on the 1st of August, I have somebody starting on 15th, and I have somebody starting on the 26th. All of these learners would go into the same cohort, and they, at some stage, when they complete the unit or the module or the qualification, would undergo assessments, which will be, they will have a release of assignment or maybe sit an examination on a particular date. And then at some stage, these assessments should be done and then finally passed on to the quality manager. The quality managers will approve the assessments, and at some stage, they will go to the exam board for the results to be released. Now, the reason why accuracy of recording is important is because it allows the data to be accurate from a point of view of starting in terms of the course. And then at some stage when assessments tend to happen, again, it needs to be accurate. And then when it is finally going to the exam board or some sort of an exam board, then in some cases, in fact, when it goes to the exam board, either you're within that cohort or you are not within that cohort. And that would mean that at some stage, the recording of registration itself has to be done accurately so that learners fall within the same cohort or the same group for them to be certificated at the end of the year. And that is why accuracy of recording, or in this case, registration of information for the learner has to be done, in a consistent time. And in most cases, awarding bodies either prescribe 14 days or 28 days. And if that time period has elapsed, then the learners, then suggested to join the next cohort, which then allows the learner to fall into the grouping wherein the exam and assessment boards would happen. And then the release of certification at some point in time would happen for those learners. Now, in reporting, we look at standard reporting. Now, there are lots of procedures and processes for reporting. And the reason why we need to look at generating reports is because there are different stakeholders within the organization. And these different stakeholders need to be able to get access to information, about learners. So these stakeholders could be parents, these could be teachers, tutors, assessors, quality managers, course leaders or program leaders, and in some cases, management within the institution. Now, what kind of reports they would need? Parents, if you look at schools, they get an annual report card or a quarterly report card or progress report card, which primarily tells them how their, say, for example, child is actually progressing and faring within the exams or within the qualification they are studying. When you look at learners, they would have access to the assessment records so that they know how they are actually scoring on the units in terms of grade, whether they are passing, referring, or meeting the criteria, and in some cases achieving grades if it's a graded qualification. The reporting of data might be relevant for quality managers because they would want to check in terms of assessment processes and also record who are the assessors where the decisions are being made correctly. There are assessors which are making decisions incorrectly or leniently or borderline, and in such cases, training and development would need to be organized. You look at program managers or course leaders, they would need access to this data in form of reports, in terms of completion reports, achievement reports, graded reports, and these would give them idea in terms of how the learners are faring when they started the course to the time when they've finished the course. So reporting could be in different formats. And for management, it could be at the end of the year, they might relate it to annual revenues or completion rates, simply because they would want to know that if 100 students started a course, how many of them completed, what was the completion rate, what was the pass rate. And they could be different forms of reports which would be created for different types of stakeholders, which would make it easier for them to use it for decision-making processes, depending on where they are sitting within the organization. So when we do look at procedures for reporting and storing and using this information, this follows the process of managing and maintaining records, reporting of accuracy in terms of reporting, generating customized or tailor-made reports for different stakeholders. And that is something that is important element of what the internal quality assurer does within the organization. Is that okay? Any questions on this so far? The next assessment criteria that we have is what procedures you follow to maintain confidentiality of the internal assessment records and the quality assurance records. So here, I would suggest if you think of steps that are taken or policies that you follow within the institution to ensure that confidentiality is maintained both for the learner records, and obviously the assessment and quality assurance decisions. So what are the procedures we follow? One of the procedures that we follow is monitoring policy, which is to ensure that policy basically dictates how data is stored, who is responsible for storage of data, how long it is stored for, excuse me, how long is it stored for, and who has the access rights to those data. Now, in most organizations nowadays, data can be stored electronically, and data can also be stored, in the paper format. Now, most awarding bodies look at some sort of a mitigation process, and this mitigation process is typically required to be put into place because the mitigation process ensures that if, for example, if you're storing data, let's say, electronically, then in such cases, if you store data electronically, then in such cases, what we want to be able to understand is that is the facility secure enough? Is the facility going to be, if, for example, if the server is to crash, or for example, if your hardware is to crash, or if in some cases there's in the event of a fire within the organization, then how do we ensure that the data that we have is something which is safely, stored? So in such cases, what we look at is, in some cases, what we do have is what is called the annual monitoring policy within organizations. And when we look at annual monitoring policy within organizations, this annual monitoring policy ensures that there are mitigation, processes also in place as far as data storage, maintaining of records, and management of systems and administration is, concerned. Now, in some cases, if I have to show you an example of how we would get to see this, in a particular report, and where does the awarding organization, a particular awarding organization, looks at your annual monitoring policy. So in this case, if you look at the section, under the annual monitoring report, which is based on the annual monitoring policy, you would see that they need to look at your management system and administration of those systems. And within that, as you can see, there are so many different headings. So one of the headings is you have aims, policies, procedures that are supported by senior management and are in place, and the delivery and the implementation of those systems is understood by the assessment teams. Is there sufficient place to store the material? Is there a recruitment and induction process in place for the staff to understand why this is important? So as you can see, there are so many of these guidelines which are put in place to ensure that there is a administration system and a management system in place which allows the sanctity of the records to be stored securely. And in order to look at specific policies and procedures, you see how many different types of policies and procedures, are put in place from a point of view of ensuring, confidentiality and maintaining this information, in a secure and safe manner. So as you can see, there's a students' complaint policy, safeguarding policy, reasonable adjustments policy. You have learner registration, you have IQR policy, health and safety, legislation, equality and diversity, data protection and GDPR, examination policy, conflict of interest. You have public information, plagiarism and assessment, and to a certain extent, cancellation or refund within 14 days with relation to the registration policy. Now, all these policies and procedures are required for you to be able to maintain the confidentiality of the internal quality assurance process. And that is what is required to be covered, when we talk about assessment criteria 4.2, which basically talks about how do we maintain confidentiality of IQA information within the organization. So appropriate access for sharing, implementation of these policies and procedures, which allow limited access and people with access only to get hold of that information, and then storage of this information either digitally or in the paper format in such a way that there are backup systems available. So if by act of God, if something is to happen, then there is a backup available wherein this information can be retrieved from that backup for the purposes of inspection, audit, and even, I would say, spot checks, which are typically carried out within centers to ensure that the policies and procedures are in place to be able to, to see them, whether they are running or not, so they are functional or not. And that is what is required to be understood as an IQA, as a person who's working within the role of the internal quality assurance officer within an organization. They need to be aware of these policies and procedures so that they are able to conduct and manage this process in a way which is required, meeting the guidelines of the awarding body, or in certain cases, different organizations within their own educational setup or the institution. Is that okay? So
Yes,
very
that's fine.
simple assessment criteria today from a point of view of what we need to understand from an IQA point of view. And here the focus is primarily on ensuring that you understand policies and procedures which are required to keep the information confidential, to maintain the sanctity of the information process, and people with relevant or there are relevant procedures and access defined which allow people to access that information as and when required for the purposes of inspections, audit, internal, meetings, records, and various stakeholders who might need that information to be processed as a report. And that would then allow them to use that information for the purposes of decision making. Is that okay? Any questions on this learning outcome today?
No, nothing.
Any questions, Reena?
No, sir, nothing so far.
Okay, so that brings us to the end of learning outcome 4 as well. What I would do at some stage now would be to primarily, share, one report, which is along with the 2-3 policies that I mentioned, so that you are able to relate it to at a later stage when we get into the assessment sorry, the assignment part of the unit, and they would require you to evidence the monitoring policy and how the records are managed, stored, and retrieved, depending on the access permissions provided by the IQA within the organization. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's
Good stuff. So I will catch up with you next week to discuss learning outcome 5, which is the last, I think, part of the learning outcome in this particular unit. And that would allow us to bring this unit to a close. And what we'll do is look at the assignment discussion, in that week itself, after we complete learning outcome 5. So till then.